to AF's event on modern conservatism and free markets. I am pleased to be joined by Senator Pat Toomey for an opening discussion of the topics. As everyone knows, Senator Toomey served 2 terms in the Senate representing the great state of Pennsylvania, my birthplace, and also 3 terms in the House of Representatives. And we're delighted to have him here today. And thank you for doing this. And thank you right now for your service to the Republic.
Well, thanks very much, Doug. Thanks for your service, and thanks for inviting me to participate today.
So where to jump in? There are lots of things going on that catch at least my eye, such as the federal government taking a 10% stake in Intel, 15% of the revenues for NVIDIA for sales into China, the Defense Department taking a majority stake in a rare earths mine out in California, and the golden share of Nippon Steel, something I've never seen before. So I guess my first question to you is, what do you think of these things, and how do you think about them, and are they good or bad, and why?
Yeah, I think this is a series of very bad ideas, Doug. I think they generally are justified or rationalized by some version of the argument that the government is giving something of value to these companies or industries, as the case may be, and therefore the taxpayer should get something in return, and that ought to include equity. This is a very bad idea. First of all, you could argue that the government has always and always will provide things of value to businesses. The government defends us, all of us, including our businesses, from foreign adversaries. The government provides a legal system in which people can adjudicate differences, including differences in contract matters, the infrastructure, right? The list is endless. The understanding has always been that the government provides these things, makes them generally available, and everybody covers the cost of it by chipping in their share of taxes. And we can argue and fight about what constitutes the right share. But this idea that the government should own businesses that benefit from these things, or the government should funnel resources, especially favoring certain companies or industries, and then get equity in return, this is a very, very bad idea for many reasons. So first of all, one bad policy shouldn't beget another, right? The government lending money to individual companies and industries is a very dubious proposition. The government doesn't know how to allocate capital. That's exactly what this is. This is the allocation of capital. And it so often, it almost invariably is a slippery slope that leads to further bad behavior. This is a case in point, right? With respect to Intel, it was initially a loan. And we were told that's all it is. It's just a loan. But by the way, there were a lot of strings attached to the loan, right? Intel had to behave in certain fashions that were acceptable to a left of center administration, whether it's daycare policies or DEI or labor, whatever it is. That's your first sign that the market isn't going to be making decisions here. The government is. But then the slippery slope manifests itself when the next administration comes along and says, well, wait a minute. If we're giving you this loan, it's not enough to get the money back and some interest. We should have some equity. And it's very easy to foresee, whether it's this administration or our next one, saying, well, we own a big chunk of this company. If it's not doing well, maybe it's not a bad idea to compel Apple to buy their chips. That would help. That would be good for the taxpayer, right? The company become more profitable. Why don't we do that? And so you can see where all of this leads. One of the other things it does is, of course, it invites rent seeking. I mean, the whole world sees what's happening, and people are asking themselves, well, if Intel can get a big pile of money from the government, it has to give up some equity, but if you need a big pile of money, maybe that's the place to go. And so you incentivize people developing strategies to ingratiate themselves with the political decision makers who can funnel money their way, rather than figuring out, how do I build a better product, a better service? Yet another reason is, once you get that money, your biggest incentive might very well be to satisfy your biggest shareholder. And that might have nothing to do with the dynamic needs of an ever rapidly changing economy. So I have to say, Doug, I remain completely unpersuaded by the merits of this approach. I've never thought that any degree of socialism really is a good solution for the American economy. And I know that that word gets overused, and these are relatively small stakes, and it's just a few companies and industries. But we're told the list is going to grow, and it's directionally very, very bad, even if it hasn't reached a huge magnitude yet.
Well, I think that there's a lot to that. But the argument that comes up again and again is that no, Doug, when you complain about this, what about the national security aspects of rare earths? We need to get rare earths. China has them. We don't. The Defense Department needs them. Chips are essential for modern national security. We have to have the domestic chip industry, so that's a national security issue. Where do you put the national security imperatives in this conversation?
Yeah, look, I think that is one very valid consideration, right? I don't think we want to be dependent on a potential adversary for an essential national security item. It probably makes sense to have incentives broadly available to American companies to provide those sorts of things, but it doesn't seem that that's what's really driving this, Doug, although it's invoked frequently. So take the case of NVIDIA. We were told that NVIDIA couldn't sell certain categories of chips to China because China's an adversary and could use them for hostile purposes. And then all of a sudden we find out it's all okay as long as we get 15% VIG. Well, wait a minute. How did the 15% VIG eliminate the national security risk? Obviously, both can't be true, right? So I think we should be very careful when we're hearing that argument about whether it is a genuine argument or whether it is an excuse.
Well, at least for me, the most vivid example of that is TikTok, where we passed a law that said it's a national security issue. Here's the date certain by which we should no longer have it in the United States, and it's still here. So either it wasn't a national security issue, or we don't care. It's hard to defend that one, I think.
Well, there's a real question about whether the law is being followed.
Yeah, I agree with that. Let me flip it just while we're on this topic. We put 10% into Intel. Doesn't that now make them a state-owned enterprise? And can they compete in the global economy? We have tried to train the rest of the world that having the state-owned enterprises is not fair competition. How does this play out?
Yeah, it dramatically undermines the case we've been making, mostly with a lot of success, that this is not the right direction to go. And one of the many ironies of this is, people sometimes, another argument in addition to the national security one, is people will say, well, look at how the Chinese economy has grown. They must be doing something right. So let's do what they've been doing, or at least some version thereof. Wildly misreading the situation, right? China has had a spectacular growth rate because they started from an extremely low base. They took advantage of Western technology that allowed them to grow very, very rapidly, and they introduced capitalism. Sure, it's highly imperfect, but it's a much, much more capitalistic economy than it was 30 or 40 years ago. And the rapid acceleration in growth that we saw in China corresponded perfectly to the implementation by Deng Xiaoping of private enterprise to a very significant degree. Sure, there are state-owned companies. Sure, it doesn't have the kind of dynamism that we have. But this is going to lead to China, in my view, reaching a slower level of growth, a much slower rate of growth going forward as they have developed. And it's not something we should be emulating.
Well, speaking of international competition and China, as president in his first term, Mr. Trump levied tariffs against China to constrain their behavior and get them to play by the rules of the global trading system. Now he has levied tariffs on an enormous number of individual sectors based with the grounds on national security, and a universal tariff of 15%, reciprocal tariffs. You go down the list.
Right.
What's your take on where we are in A, dealing with genuine international trading violations? B, was there something wrong with the global trading system, doesn't need to be reordered? And then in general, tariffs, how do they play out for the U.S. economy?
Yeah, there's an awful lot to try to unbundle there, Doug, as you know.
Yeah, I'll give you at least 3 minutes. Go for it.
Then I'm good. I'm good. So let me first quibble about something that I think matters. You know, language is so important, and all of us fall into an easy habit of using shortcuts in language, right? Because it's convenient, it's quick, and people understand what we mean. And so we talk about tariffs on China, tariffs on the EU, tariffs on India. In all cases, that's completely wrong. Tariffs are on American consumers who purchase goods from China or American consumers who purchase goods from Europe. Now, that takes longer to say, right?
Yeah.
And it's a big mouthful, and nobody wants to say it. But when we say tariffs on China, it contributes to this wild mischaracterization that somehow they're paying the tariffs. They're not. We're paying the tariffs. The check literally gets written by the importing company. And then the question is just, how much do they absorb? How much do they pass on? And we should just remind ourselves all the time that this is a tax on us. So my argument on this is to step back for a second. What's the optimal outcome? What's the optimal goal? To me, the optimal goal has always been zero government imposed friction on international trade. So you should have no quotas, no tariffs. It should be mutual, it should be reciprocal. And if we have that, we would have a stronger economy. The world would have a stronger economy. Everybody would have a higher standard of living than we have with this hodgepodge of taxes on trade, which just impede the ability of human beings to, continuously discover better and more efficient ways to engage in trade. We know that that's not President Trump's goal, right? His goal is not to get to zero reciprocal tariffs. He's been offered that by some countries and he's turned it down.
Yep.
He believes that tariffs are a great thing in and of themselves. He really believes that. I think he also believes that if you have a trade deficit with another country, in other words, Americans buy more things from a particular country than that country happens to buy from Americans, that the difference is the measure of the amount they're stealing from us. And he talks about it as a ripoff and a theft all the time. These are wildly mistaken notions. So if the tariffs were being used as a temporary tool to get to a mutual zero tariff, zero obstacles, then, you'd have to make the point that maybe the ends justify those means if that's where you're going to end up. But that's not where we're going to end up. So we get contradicting messages about what the real goal is, right? Sometimes we're told that they are tools meant to open up markets. But on the other hand, we're told they're going to bring in trillions of dollars over many years. Well, if they're the former, then presumably they get reduced when the trading partner complies with our demands. But if that happens, then they're not going to generate trillions of dollars of revenue, right? So you can't have it both ways. But let's assume that the real intent, ultimately, the ambition, the dream of the proponents of this tariff policy is to create barriers to competition so that America can experience a renaissance in manufacturing, right? Then we have all these manufacturing jobs and the economy will be so much better. And that is the outcome that we're trying to get to. And it's worth going through some pain if that's where we get to. My argument to that is, well, that outcome is extremely unlikely for reasons I can happy to share with you. But even if we got there, it means a diminished standard of living for Americans, because the only way we get there, by their own construct, by their own logic, that of the protectionists, is to make sure that American manufacturers don't have to compete with people who can build a widget at a better price or provide a better product. And so Americans don't get to save that money. They don't get to buy that product. Their standard of living goes down because they can afford less of the things they need. So why would we want that outcome? It's not a great outcome. By the way, I said earlier, it's not likely that even that would happen. And here's why. How are we going to have a renaissance in manufacturing when we impose a policy, these tariffs, that raise the cost of American manufacturing, right? About half of all, right? You know this, right? About half of all the products that we import are inputs used by manufacturers to make some end product or intermediary product, many of which are meant to be exported.
Yeah.
Well, the tariffs raise the cost of the Americans to make that product and export it. And if the rest of the world has the good sense not to impose these tariffs on their consumers and their importers, then we are at a systematic disadvantage. How are we going to sustain a manufacturing renaissance when we put our manufacturers at a systematic disadvantage? I don't see it.
So let's go to the specifics of the so-called IEEPA tariffs levied under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, headed toward the Supreme Court. Is this an emergency to have a current account deficit? B, do you think the president has the authority? And I guess in the background, where does Congress fit in on all this? Congress has delegated this to the presidency over many, many years.
So does not define emergency, but Webster does. And in common usage, we understand that an emergency is generally and I don't have the dictionary in front of me, Doug, and you might do a better job than me, but I think the gist of it is an unforeseen, severe, sudden change in circumstances that requires, some kind of action that wouldn't meet Webster's standards, but I think it's close enough. Well, how does a 50-year chronic surplus in our capital account and deficit in our trade account constitute an emergency? But where's the emergency there? That would be question number one. Obviously, there's not an emergency. Now, some have tried to, in the administration, have gone on a very, very tenuous limb here and suggested, well, it's been going on for a long time, but we're about to reach a tipping point. That's why it's an emergency. Well, I would ask, what tips? What are we tipping into? No, the fact of the matter is, America has been by far and away the number one preferred destination for capital. People all around the world want to invest in America. That keeps the value of the dollar higher than it would be if we were not an attractive destination for capital. And that makes it affordable for us to buy products from all around the world, including the products we make ourselves. That's the nature of what's happening here. Americans are a richer country than any other big country in the world, almost any country at all in the world. And so it's not shocking that we are consumers. There's no emergency here. There hasn't been one for 50 years. Look at the language, or if you look at the argument the administration is making, it's to the courts, hey, you've got no business second guessing a presidential declaration of emergency. That's the president's discretion. That's not yours. But by that logic, if that's the case, then any American president could wake up any morning and say, tomorrow is Wednesday, and that's an emergency. Wednesday is an emergency. And so I'm going to do X, Y, and Z that are not even contemplated in this bill. By the way, IEEPA doesn't have the word tariff, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to reorder, say, the world's trading system. I'm going to impose all these taxes. Those are not authorized in this legislation. I think if the Supreme Court cares about being taken seriously as an independent body, which it should be incredibly concerned, it has to determine that this is an abuse of IEEPA. Last point to your question about where's Congress. This is a hugely disappointing development for me, that Congress has chosen to be a non-participating bystander. As you know, Doug, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution delineates the responsibilities of Congress. And on the list is managing international trade. And on the list is taxation. No president has the authority in the Constitution to unilaterally raise taxes or to unilaterally manage trade this way. And yet this is happening, and Congress is allowing it to happen. This is a huge and inappropriate, and I think ultimately unwise and dangerous aggregation of power in the executive. It violates the construct of the separation of powers and the checks and balances, and it's not healthy for our country.
Well, thank you. As it turns out, you used the magic word independence, and you did it on a day when the Federal Reserve Open Market Committee is meeting, and we're running out of time. But I did want to get your thoughts on the Fed, the importance of its independence, and your take on what we've seen in the past several months.
Yeah. So I've been very, very critical of the Fed. I was when I was in the Senate. I was a ranking member of the Banking Committee, and throughout my time on the Banking Committee, during the COVID period and after, I was very critical. I thought the Fed was maintaining a zero interest rate policy, which, by the way, is a negative real interest rate policy, for way too long, and a quantitative easing, buying bonds, and including even mortgage-backed securities, which is really an allocation of capital. I was very critical of all of this. The Fed shouldn't be doing it. But the idea that one of the political branches of Congress should dictate monetary policy on a day-to-day basis, I think, is worse. This is also an area, by the way, as you know, that the Constitution assigns responsibility to Congress. It does not assign responsibility for the coining of currency and the managing of currency to the executive at all. So Congress said, okay, how are we going to manage this in a big, complicated economy? Even though it was, 100 years ago, the economy was already big and complicated. We probably shouldn't be setting monetary policy. So let's create an entity, and it's this quasi-public, quasi-private, unusual entity, and let's charge that entity with the responsibility of conducting monetary policy. Now, I've got a lot of criticisms about how the Fed has done that in recent years. I kind of like a rules-based approach myself. But Congress took its own area of responsibility, created a administrator, if you will, a vehicle for implementing that policy. And it included the president by authorizing a president to nominate, subject to Senate confirmation, the people who would run it. How does that become the president gets to decide what monetary policy is? How does that become the executive branch is in charge of something that the Constitution explicitly assigns to Congress? It's another arrogation of power that is completely inappropriate, and Congress should be asserting itself, in my view.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to share those views. I always admired your clarity of thought as a ranking member on the Banking Committee, and I appreciate you sharing it with us today. And with that, we're going to excuse you with great thanks and move to the panel.
All right. Thanks very much, Doug.
Thank you. So let me welcome Paul Krawczak, who will moderate the panel. Paul is a senior writer for CQ Roll Call and a longtime observer of all things Washington policy. We thank him for joining us today, and he will introduce the members of the panel.
Doug, thank you very much. Great to be here. I'm delighted to introduce our panelists who have joined us for this conversation. Dr. Ben Harris is Vice President and Director of Economic Studies at the Brookings Institution. James Pethokoukis is Senior Fellow, DeWitt Wallace Chair and Editor at the American Enterprise Institute. And Dr. Veronique de Rougy is George Gibbs Chair in Political Economy and Senior Research Fellow at George Mason University's Mercatus Center. To follow up on the conversation between Senator Toomey and Doug, let me start off by asking you this question. There was some discussion of these Section 232 national security tariffs that have been implemented. I'm wondering if you find those more defensible than the other tariffs. Ben, could we start with you on this?
Yeah, so in general, I think that the Trump administration, so the 232 tariffs are a class of tariffs which are legal, they're targeted, and they require some level of study before they're implemented. There's really no question about their legality, which I think is important. They're very different than the IEEPA-based tariffs that were levied on Liberation Day. I think that they're more justifiable than the sweeping tariffs that we saw. Economists are still trying to understand why, as the senator just said, why trade imbalances are such a big problem and why you'd use sweeping tariffs to address them. So the 232 tariffs, look, I mean, I think of the name of national security, it's a little silly, levying tariffs on our allies. But more broadly, as a class of tariffs, which are targeted, which are imposed through a system which is designed to introduce thought and analysis, I don't think that they're so crazy. So for me, in general, I see a really big difference between the Trump administration 1.0 trade approach and the Trump 2.0 trade approach, which is probably illegal and is ill-advised from an economic perspective.
Thank you. Jim, if we could go to you, I'm wondering what your thoughts are and if you think that even the national security tariffs have been abused.
Well, yeah, I kind of do. I think if I were approaching the issue of trade from a national security perspective, I would think that in an ideal world, we would view our allies as just that we're the leader of the free world, and our allies are part of a group that will stand up to China, who's supposedly the geo-competitor, if not worse. So that, I mean, we're one country. We're a country of 330 million, and our allies can be a tremendous help. And what the tariffs have done is say that actually we really don't view you as allies. We view you as competitors, maybe no different, maybe worse than China. So I think we're going down a really bad road. That as leader of the free world, we should act like it and embrace other liberal democracies. And that's what we would want. We want a league of liberal democracies that engage with free trade with one another. And from that foundation, then we begin to confront what I think is a fairly serious military challenge from China.
Vero, do you have any thoughts on the national security tariffs?
Yeah, I do. I entirely agree with Ben that the distinction is quite important between that the 232 tariffs are legal as opposed to, it seems, the other tariffs and the other practice in Trump too. That said, it doesn't mean that the justification used to deploy those legal tariffs is not bunkers. Even during Trump 1, the steel tariffs were presented as this big national security reason. I mean, the reason was national security, even though the military was saying, hey, we're okay. We're totally okay. We have all the steel we need. We have everything we need. And so there's the legality is key, especially while dealing with this administration, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't actually be very critical of skeptical of the way even legal tools are deployed. I mean, I agree with Jim. I mean, like going after our trading partners is quite insane from a national security perspective, because often our trading partners are our national security partners too. It doesn't mean that they're perfect. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that the U.S. Was right to try to actually justify and get the Europeans to actually build their own defense is not a bad idea. What I really worry about is the fact that this administration and other people may learn the wrong lessons from this deployment of tariffs, as if tariffs are these magical tools that can get countries to do all sorts of things you want them to do, when really what it is the American government flexing its muscles can actually go a long way to get other countries to do things. And I'm really worried that we're entering this era where there's this magical thinking when it comes to tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in real fast, I mean, these are ex post facto justifications for a policy that President Trump has believed in, for 40 years. I think, as Senator Toomey rightly said, he believes that trade deficits trade deficits ipso facto are signs of we are losing to some competition, that other countries are taking advantage of us, that they are stealing our prosperity. So then, sort of center right economists, some center right pundits, some too many, will come up with other justifications that make what is sort of a universally panned interpretation of trade economics sound more plausible, and that's what's going on. And I think to sort of merely accept these justifications is really distraction from the president's rather idiosyncratic view of trade economics, which, by mere fact that he is the president and the leader of the Republican Party, has de facto become Republican economics.
An interesting point was raised, and that is that tariffs may not achieve their stated purpose. Vero, you in particular talked about that. I'd like to pursue that. Ben, do you have any? Can you think of any examples of how tariffs will not be effective in terms of what they are meant to do?
Yeah, but let me just enthusiastically agree with my co-panelists, which is I'm not sure what they're meant to do because the justification keeps changing. I mean, a huge +1 to each one of their points. I don't really understand why they were levied. Is it to raise revenue? And the senator mentioned this as well. Is it to raise revenue? Is it to shift supply chains? Is it because of some fundamental justification, some fundamental belief that free trade is harming the United States? So it's a little tough to respond to that. But let me give you one example. In general, if you want to shift production back to the United States, and I have big problems with that general statement, you want to have the capacity of the United States first, and then you levy the tariffs. The tariffs were levied before we had the capacity to produce many of the things in the United States. One good example is around pharmaceuticals. So many pharmaceuticals are produced in either China or India. A lot of the products come from India. We don't have the factories to produce particularly generic drugs in the United States. It's not profitable. And even if it was heavily subsidized by the government, it would take 3 to 5 years to do so. So now we've levied 50% tariffs on India, partially in the name of anti-Russia energy policy, which is a whole different topic. I'm happy to go into that. But we don't have the capacity to produce these generic drugs, a lot of them used for things like treating cancer or for people who are going through chemotherapy treatment. So that's completely counterproductive. All that will happen is, at best, the prices will rise, and at worst, we'll see shortages. So that's an example of just completely counterproductive trade policy that will lead to outcomes I don't think the administration intended.
Vero, is that the way you see it as well?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, the senator has hinted at, that's actually kind of made the case that these make no sense. I mean, Ben is entirely correct. Even if you wanted to do what the president claims he wants to do, which is to build up manufacturing, to shift supply chain, you should start by building the stuff here. But of course, they would tell you, well, they need the incentive to actually shift the supply chain here. But nonetheless, Ben is entirely correct that this is the way you would go about it. But the thing that seems to be lost on this administration, and I just can't imagine that someone hasn't explained this many times to the president, is that most of what we import are inputs that we put that producers. This distinction between producers and consumers is one that is extremely frustrating, because a lot of producers are consumers of input. A lot of importers are the biggest exporters. In fact, our biggest importers are our biggest importers. Whether it's a foreign company that wants to build here, to jump the tariff and start producing with less cost, still has to import a great deal in the current level. So this way of going about shifting supply chains, building manufacturing here, by the way, all of it built on this notion that somehow manufacturing in America has been utterly devastated based on the reduction of the share of labor in manufacturing is so weird because it's actually the reason why we're so productive and still so rich relatively to a lot of countries is precisely because American manufacturing, there may be problems, been so innovative. So it just, no matter how you take it, and I can't remember who said this, it's hard to, Ben, I think, said this, it's hard to even offer kind of a response to what is being done because you just don't know exactly how to kind of handle this stinky diaper, for lack of a better word.
I'd like to ask you about the global trading system in a minute, but first I'd like to ask a different question. One of the arguments for some of the tariffs is that countries like China have not played fair, that they've subsidized their industries and they've put up various trade barriers, and some other countries as well. Is there a justification for tariffs that are meant to, I guess, maybe equalize trade barriers between the U.S. and China and the U.S. and other countries? Jim, could you go first?
Well, I think Senator Toomey is right that the trade barriers you're hurting yourself. So I think I would be very cautious about proceeding down that path. And let's remember sort of the context of what we're doing. The context is that China is winning, that China ruined America in the early 2000s by stealing away manufacturing, and that devastated all these communities and made America a worse place. Like that is sort of the founding myth of American populism. It's the founding myth of sort of the nationalist conservative movement. That and what President, and to put in the language of President Trump, that the United States got suckered at best. At worst, that all these sort of evil elites knew this would happen, and that all these jobs and their companies profited by all this offshoring, and it's been a tremendous disaster, and therefore tariffs are the solution. So that means that is the mythology. The mere fact that after this, devastating economic event, the U.S. is richer than it was 25 years ago. All our industries were not devastated. The last time I sort of checked, the top 20 most valuable companies, it's almost like all American companies. So the mythology, so that's one part of that mythology. And the other part of the mythology is sort of China figured it out. China figured out a way to do economic growth, and therefore we need to learn the lesson. And their way of economic growth was through subsidies and limiting access to their markets. And therefore we need to learn that lesson. And that is, I think, that played a huge role in sort of the nationalist conservative movement. Now, again, Senator Toomey said that would be a terrible lesson to draw, because the last time I checked, China is still a very poor country. China is a country with almost zero, if not negative, productivity growth. And again, for those who've been around long enough, and President Trump is one of those people, it is an exact replay of sort of the mythology that we saw during President Trump's sort of formative years in public life in the 1980s, where you had these people say, oh, look at Japan. Japan figured out a new way of doing trade, of doing economic growth, and therefore we need to follow them. Now, back then, you had a lot, it was sort of the Atari Democrats. Today, it's sort of the Trump Republicans who are drawing absolutely the wrong lesson. So again, to get back, I would love to see lots of free trade among free nations. I think I would be very careful about exporting, key military components, but very narrowly to China. But I would start from a basis. that open trade is the best way to create a prosperous country and an efficient private sector.
Vero, do you see any merit in equalizing tariffs vis-a-vis other countries?
No, I don't. I don't. I mean, like first, I think it's important to kind of remind people that while our trade with China is very important, it's not as big as people think. I mean, I think a lot of people think that our trade with China is like 50% of what we import comes from China. It's not true. I think it's around 11%. I mean, it's not negligible. It's important. It's also important to kind of understand that a lot of what we import, I think it's like 95% or 90% of what we import is just like things that are just nothing to do with national security, nothing to do with anything of real importance. In fact, it's, I mean, as the vice president said, it's like toasters and part of toasters and stuff like this. And so while I think like no free trader would say that there's not a cause for tariff for national security and maybe potentially geopolitical reason. It has to be real reasons, which often we found is with this administration and during the first term usually are bogus national security reason. But we'd agree with that. But otherwise, trade that is not actually dangerous in nature is a problem. What about the subsidies? It is true that their subsidies are real. I mean, they're really like pumping subsidies in favored industry, but this is at the cost of their economy. It's like while we're seeing, potentially the benefits. I mean, they're always short-lived, in my opinion, but of subsidizing. I mean, the resources are drawn from other part of the economy. There's a reason why actually government-driven economic activities, don't benefit the country as a whole. And by the way, it's important to say that before, in order to be an export-driven economy, China has had to import a ton of things. So this misunderstanding between like the glory of export versus import, I mean, China imports actually a lot too. And finally, if we believe that the subsidies are a real problem, we had a remedy against that. We had a remedy against a country massively subsidizing its economy and its exports and potentially creating really unfair equilibriums. And that's the WTO. But this administration has decided to dismantle that. The WTO was not something we should value. And that's the problem, that the real tool we had to actually address this issue is not used. So this is a long way to say no. I just don't think. While I think that there may be cause for tariffs for national security, true national security issues, I think that this is what's happening here. Is like I join Jim. I'm in favor of his position on this.
Paul,
Thank you.
With a real quick point, which is to say on tariffs, I agree with everything. I think that it's incredibly damaging to the U.S. economy. The incidence falls on the American consumer largely, and also on businesses. But if I was going to rank my concerns with tariffs, the economic concerns would be pretty close to last. What I'm really concerned about is infringements on the rule of law, and what I'm really, really concerned about is what Jim brought out from the outset, which is a reshuffling of global allegiances. And it is very scary to live in a world in which the United States has retreated from its global position, economically, geopolitically, and otherwise, and has surrendered that leadership to other countries like China. I was speaking with the CEO of a large firm the other day, of a large investment firm the other day, and I said, what's the one metric you're tracking to determine the long-term implications of the Trump trade policy? And he said, I would track the number of flights out of Europe into China. And so I'm just very worried about a world in which the United States retreats from the world in terms of trade, in terms of other military relationships and the like, geopolitical relationships and the like, and that damage can't be undone with an executive order. So I'm very worried about the economic implications, but it's not high on my list relative to other concerns.
That's interesting. So you're talking about the foreign policy implications. Jim, are you seeing any impacts in terms of the United States relationship with with our allies and other countries as a result of the tariff policy?
You know, well, there's this, there's this notion of sort of, soft power, where you kind of get other countries to go along with you without sort of, without threats of tariffs, without military action. It's this sort of softer relationship you have with other countries, which the U.S. has had fantastic soft power. People admire us for our economy. They admire us for our economic strength. But they admire us for that we are a well-run country, rule of law. Not only are we a model for developing countries, but people in other rich countries saw the U.S. sort of admirable. Why? Why do our movies do so well why do all those Marvel movies do so well overseas? Because they come from a place that people sort of admire. It's thematically in sync with the United States being the leader of the world. What the tariffs say are, we don't value. We really believe sort of America alone, not just America first, but America alone. We view you as a competitor in an absolutely zero-sum game. In a world where we have sort of this rising alliance of illiberal at best powers, Russia, China, obviously, North Korea, Iran, to sacrifice these sort of natural friends, other liberal democracies, in the name of sort of this really transactional view of international relations, garnered from the real estate scene, New York, the Manhattan real estate scene of the 1980s. I've certainly talked to people overseas, people, government officials, people from think tanks, and the one question I ask, will you ever trust America again? And and the answer is generally, how can we? From a trusted ally that, as the saying goes, what's the Churchill saying? We'll do the wrong, we'll always do the wrong thing, but eventually we'll do the right thing. Now they believe, we'll go through every other option and then we'll choose the wrong one. So that's what we believe. And I don't see that doesn't have an effect on America's ability to operate effectively in the world in the future.
Vero, do you see tariffs affecting foreign policy?
I assume I don't know foreign policy, but I can comment on what Jim just said. I just got back from France. France has its lot of problems, but talking with family members, they actually didn't even realize that they trusted America, and that they always made fun, like that the perception of France was the Americans were they're like cowboys, and they didn't really quite kind of wrap their heads around what America meant to them, and how kind of they take it for granted, the stability and the strength, and honestly the very positive externality that America created and the stability created, and this commitment to the rule of law, that to defending allies, to trading partners, to national security partners, meant until it was taken away. And one of the things that you realize is these people are they're freaking out, because they do realize that some of the things that they took for granted without really appreciating what America provided for the world is now that it's gone, they have to behave as if it's gone. And unfortunately, I think Jim raised indirectly a really important point when it comes to countries like China, Iran, and others, is that all these countries that took America for granted, that are now freaking out, they're not also in a position to actually do what it takes to actually replace what has been taken. So I can't, though I don't understand foreign policy well, I can't be left with anything but a sense of dread. And I'm certainly not a hawk. There's a lot of things I didn't like in foreign policy, and but it's certainly extremely worrisome.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience, and the question is, for all of you panelists, the last decade has seen successive governments show an increased willingness to go after individual companies by name, from President Trump and Intel to FHFA Director Pulte and FICO. What is the likely impact of this on investment in the business environment? Start with you, Ben.
So it's tough for a lot of these factors which have come up recently. It's tough to understand the long-term consequences. It does seem like businesses are in a standstill when it comes to investment. They're not pulling it out, but they're also not pouring it in. Investors around the globe continue to see the U.S. as an attractive place to invest. So that really hasn't been an issue, aside from about a month in April when it looked like foreign investors were pulling their capital from the U.S. But in general, I think it's just tough to quantify. For a lot of these factors, these things will play out over years and decades, not months. So my sense is that over time, on the margin, these will all have an impact. But you can't pick it out in the data right now. You can say that corporate investment has slowed, but that's probably due to a host of factors, including the tariff regime, which has been put in place. But in general, I will say, I mean, I'm obviously troubled by this. I consider myself a pro-business Democrat. I want to be fair, so I'll say I was also critical of the Biden administration when I was serving in it, of similar. It's similar in direction. It's not similar in magnitude in terms of calling out businesses by name and criticizing businesses that in times I didn't think deserved to be criticized. But I guess the long and short of it is you want to create a positive environment in which businesses can invest in the United States, and not having a role for the executive office to go ahead and make these unilateral decisions as far as who's good and who's not is part of that positive business environment. But it's just really tough to quantify what the precise impact will be.
Thank you. Jim, do you see any investment impact yet?
Well, I mean, I think the Trump economic policy as a whole has created tremendous uncertainty, and I think investment is less than it would be otherwise. I guess I'm more concerned about business decision making, how in the future businesses will make decisions if they have to assume that if they make the wrong decision, if they import something that the president would prefer made here, if they open a business somewhere that the president would rather be done here. I mean, if you're trying to game out your business decisions by getting inside the head of one person, I don't see that helps your decision making. And I think more broadly, I think what you want in an economy is, like, it sounds like kind of like a McKinsey phrase, but you want like maximum competitive intensity. You want companies competing against each other, and then the best company wins. And if a company can't compete, it goes out of business, and its workers and that capital is reallocated elsewhere. That is not the kind of economy that the president, if you want to call it Trumponomics, is talking about. There you have they have certain companies that the president decides on for whatever reason will be favored. Maybe they'll be favored because it fits his view of the world. Maybe it'll be favored because the last time the CEO visited him, he brought some sort of gold-plated knick-knack. Those people will be favored. And if you're not favored, and the risk is that it's going to be big, established companies that can lobby Congress, that have access to the Oval Office. Those are the kind of companies that will be favored. So what you're looking at is, I don't know if the phrase would be corporatist economy. It does not sound like a recipe for dynamism. And Ben said, like, this could be bad at the margins. Well, we have an economy that, if you listen to the Fed, is supposed to be growing long-term about 1.8%. that's like, half of what it's grown since World War II. Is that kind of economy grow fast enough where people can look at their lives and think, yeah, I'm better off than I was 10 years ago. I can see how my kids are going to be better off. I think that's awfully slow. And I think what you're talking about is an economy that will grow even slower than that under a scenario where certain companies are rewarded. Companies don't know how to make decisions because they have to predict how the executive branch will decide. And I think then you create a self-feeding cycle of sort of more discontent, maybe more populism. So no, I don't think the economy will be better off over the long term under this kind of sort of central planning kind of regime.
Yeah. Vero, just quickly, do you similar thoughts on uncertainty and politicization?
I agree with Ben, and I agree with Jim. I mean, I like to say, one of the area that may kind of get things less worse than they would have been is the full expensing, the permanent full expensing, like is going to be good for investment, whether it compensates for the tariffs, which, by the way, one of the things that this administration doesn't seem to understand is the tight connection that exists between actually putting tariffs, hence stopping or reducing the amount of stuff we buy from foreigners, and then the money that comes back to the U.S. to be invested or to buy our treasuries or all of this is kind of actually tied together. And I just don't understand how the president is talking about all these deals and all these investment into the U.S. I will believe it when I see these investments at this level, because I mean the connection between imports and or between at least the stuff we buy and the dollars we send and the money that comes back is real. And as a result, I mean, it's going to be impacted a great deal. So, I mean, I agree. I think just structurally, the randomness of the you're favored because I like you, you've said this thing, or I don't like you because of this. This is bad for business. It is bad for business. It goes against what America stands for, and it is. And it's all the more disturbing with this administration that in the end, the president doesn't seem, apart from the tariff, it doesn't seem to be driven by a particular philosophy. It's so random. It depends on, the mood of the day, and that is a recipe for disaster.
Thank you. To continue on this topic of federal involvement in the private sector, Senator Rand Paul recently called the federal government's 10% stake in Intel, quote, a step toward socialism, unquote. I'm wondering if you agree or disagree, and what are the implications of this going forward? Start with you, Ben.
Yeah, I mean, it is a step towards socialism. The government shouldn't own companies. It's not the role of the federal government. And it's, at best, it leads to inefficient allocation of capital. And at worst, I think you see a breakdown in democracy. Let me just give you just one example. This thing I found really troubling. Two things, actually, to make the point. This isn't just about our economy, but it's also about our fundamental, democratic values, which is we have an event at Brookings on Thursday discussing threats to data credibility, largely drawn out of the firing of the BLS commissioner. It was almost impossible to get anyone from the private sector to come and talk publicly about this issue. Now, everyone in the private sector agrees that data credibility is important and the BLS commissioner should not have been fired. I haven't heard anyone argue, off camera that's the case. But yet these corporations are afraid to come out and speak against the policy because they don't want to be punished. I mean, that's not just bad economics, that's bad democracy. I was told separately about an academic who pulled a publication with Brookings because they came from a university they felt where it was under fire and didn't want to see their funding get pulled. I mean, what's more undemocratic than that? So, this whole approach, I mean, is it a step towards socialism? Of course it's a step towards socialism. I don't really see how you can take the other side of it. But it's in some ways even worse than that.
Jim, what do you think about that?
I think, unfortunately, that you see sort of the I don't know if it's the progressive left, and you see sort of the national right, just they really agree that an economy which is fundamentally driven by market forces, and by that I mean the millions and millions of bottom-up decisions by consumers, investors, and business, is all that is ultimately should be the primary force driving an economy. That's what they believe. It's a kind of populism. And whether you want to call it socialism or something else, it's a belief in that government can make these decisions and direct the economy. The government has that kind of competence in very broad ways to direct, and not so broad ways to direct the economy. So, I mean, that's a theory. I don't think they can point to any models where a wealthy country has decided to go that way and is shown to sort of outgrow the United States. So I'm not sure where their case study is that says like that's a great way to run an economy. And that's what they believe. And it used to be something that was more on the left. Now you can find it on the left and on the right, and we can discuss why I think that's happened. But again, whether you want to give it that label, I think I would call it a belief in central planning. And I think poor examples of that being successful.
Thanks. Vero, do you call this socialism?
I mean, I entirely agree with what Ben said. I mean, what we call it in the end doesn't matter. It's a question of degree. It's bad. It's not just bad economics. It's bad for our democracy. It's bad for all sorts of things. And Jim is entirely correct that in the end, it really, unfortunately, we have this belief on the right and on the left. I mean, it's obviously not widespread. I mean, well, I guess it is widespread since it is the actually current administration of the United States. But I mean, this idea of taking a 10% stake in Intel is a Senator Sanders idea, right, on the left. So it's like there's this shoe horse thing. But whatever it is we call it, it's bad.
I have kind of a multifaceted question here that comes from a member of the audience. So Senator Toomey asked, why is Congress allowing the administration to do these things on trade and tariffs when that's Congress's responsibility? If we look at tariffs, if we look at a lot of the other things the Trump administration is doing, Republicans have generally supported it. There hasn't been a lot of objection. The question from the audience is, Senator Toomey touched briefly on the appropriate role of Congress. Is Congress failing to limit the executive? And what precedent does this set? Start with you, Ben.
So one thing that puzzles me a bit about the Trump administration is that they're governing as though the world ends in 2029. Is that there will never be another Democratic president who will then again impose, its will in ways that they probably find objectionable. The expansion, I get that there has been this long-term expansion of executive power that included prior administrations in addition to the Trump administration. But it's of a different ilk this time. I mean, it's much stronger, it's much more blatant, and I think it's much more difficult to reverse. I think that the reasons are political for the reason, if you're asking why Congress hasn't pushed back, well, of course, Democrats have pushed back. But so the question is, why haven't congressional Republicans pushed back more? And the answer is that they have a very, popular president with their base, and it's effectively political suicide. And Trump is terrific at intimidation, and you see that in primaries, and you see that in other contexts. So it's, I mean, when you speak with people off the record, when the cameras are off, I mean, it's pretty clear to me that from members of both parties have a real problem with this expansion of executive power. So the question is, why aren't they saying this on camera? And the reason is it's often considered political suicide.
Jim, do you think Republicans largely agree with what's going on, or is there another reason why they seem to be supporting it?
I think you probably find newer members who think President Trump has figured something out that all the economists have missed for the past half century. Those people exist. I still think they're in the minority, and what they know for sure is that the president is super popular. They know for sure they would like another term in Congress. I think they're hoping that the American economy otherwise is so strong that it can plow its way through these tariffs, and they won't cause a recession, and they won't cause prices to rise so much that voters will complain too much. And I don't know, maybe they're hoping they'll be saved by the AI boom. But I still think that most people think this is a bad idea, and I think events will prove that right. I mean, like, will these policies, whatever their, whatever sort of the specious intellectual foundation of these policies is, will they accomplish the goal? Are we going to get rid of trade deficits? Will we be making iPhones here in the United States? No. To the first, no. To the second. So ultimately, I think like reality will intervene, and the economy will look like it is worse off for these trade policies. So I guess I would be very cautious if I were a Republican. I'd be very cautious if I were a Democrat to think that the American people, they elected Trump, they must love tariffs, so that should be in our toolbox forever. I think that will be proved to be a fool's errand.
Vero, what are your thoughts on GOP support in general for President Trump's policies?
I'm stunned. I mean, I agree that a lot of them probably disagree in private, but probably won't dare saying anything in public. But I'm astonished. I mean, I assume that if James Madison came back to he'd be stunned that Congress is actually, for decades now, like, agreed to just kind of give its power away to the executive branch. It's just that, to me, it's like this was supposed to be something that we believe, like he believed, Congress would be guarding its ability to actually legislate jealously, and we've seen for decades the opposite. And now, of course, this is the epitome. It's at a level that we may not have seen before. Can it be reversed? I don't know. But Ben is entirely right. In the same way as people like Jim and I have been telling our Democrat friend, be careful, you want expansion of executive powers. One day you may come to regret it, and I'm sure they're all regretting it right now. The Trump administration seems to believe that somehow whatever they're doing now is not going to be used to go in the other direction. And of course, we all know this is not correct. And I just don't know how we reverse it, because the trend we've been observing has been that, one administration abuses power, the other one takes it for granted, starts from there and continues further. I don't know. Congress needs to get a backbone and do something about it. But look, Senator Paul has tried was it Senator Warren? No, it wasn't Senator Warren. Senator Kaine, to get Congress to vote to reclaim some of the tariffs power, and the Republicans haven't been willing to do it.
We have another audience question, but first I'd like to follow up on something Vero said. Follow up with you first, Ben. So the implications of what President Trump, the policies President Trump has advanced, tariffs, involvement in the private sector, muscling the Federal Reserve, trying to influence the Federal Reserve. What are the future implications of this? I mean, do you someday there will be a Democratic administration and a Democratic-controlled Congress. Do you see sort of this approach being continued in future administrations?
So my hope is, and this is probably naive, that the next president, whoever that person is, and from whatever party, a major platform will be restoring some of the power of Congress and honoring some of the, the ideals of our democracy. I'm not sure if that will happen. My hope is that Americans have grown uncomfortable with the magnitude of executive power, and you see that with the No Kings protest. That's my hope, is that you'll see this populist backlash against a presidency which has grown too powerful. But in the short term, I mean, you brought up the Fed, and that's something we haven't spoken about very much. I mean, that could really be the spark that lights all of this concern, which would be a Fed which is beholden to the White House. I mean, it almost makes me sick just saying, because we've seen historically how problematic this is, and ultimately you'd see much higher inflation if we saw a Fed that wanted to come in and cut more than they should. And so, there is a chance over the next 18 months to 2 years that we see very acutely and very suddenly the economic implications of this erosion of independence at the Fed. So, a lot of economists are focused on this. A lot of pundits are focused on it. It's not like it's going to catch anyone by surprise. I think one thing is clear, which is the Trump administration is not looking past the end of its term and worried about the next presidency. They're very much focused on what this means for them right now.
Jim, feel free to comment on that, but I'd also a question, picking up from what Ben said, is the president has pushed for the Fed to lower interest rates and exerted other kinds of pressures. How are you concerned about that, and what are the implications of that?
Oh, I think the implications can be seen other places where you've had populist leaders. I mean, one thing, populists, whether you want to call them populists of the left and right, is they don't believe in constraints. And they don't believe in constraints on their own personal power. They question the constraint. They don't like markets because markets are a constraint, so they want to interfere in markets. The idea of having a independent Federal Reserve, that is a constraint. So obviously they would rather be the person choosing. And I fear what the sort of Democratic version of an unconstrained president who basically runs the central bank. Again, there is zero reason to think the result of that will not be higher inflation, a repeat of the 19. I mean, that's like the best case study we have when you have in the United States, when you have a central bank which is overly influenced by the president, you get really bad inflation. So again, fine. You think that the president should have, a lot of influence, if not direct monetary policy. What is your case study that that's going to work out really well? I think there is no case study, and once again, I think you have Republican economics being nothing more than echoing the idiosyncratic economic views of the president of the United States, like that, and everything else is just backing and filling to try to create, at least some sort of lattice work of reasonableness around that policy. I don't feel like the burden ultimately is to prove why a political Fed would be a good idea. It would be a bad idea. I think the burden is point out to where it's worked out really, really well.
Vero, you've written about the Federal Reserve.
Yeah.
What is different, if anything, about the way President Trump is interacting with the Federal Reserve compared to past presidents?
I think, I was going to say, I think what's very different is the reason they express for why they're putting this pressure. This is not the first time we get pressure. I mean, even from member of Congress, Senator Warren is a demand that the Fed, now a senator is not the president, obviously, but it's the reason. And like they're clearly, this is doing it for fiscal dominance type of reason. They're expressing the fact that higher interest rates breeds a higher interest payments, and hence they want interest rates to go down, and for fiscal reason, and that's fiscal dominance, right? And it's like it's basically the typical textbook example, and we see it, and we haven't seen this like maybe ever, I think. That said, right, and it is very reprehensible. That said, here's my fear, and I agree with Jim about what happens when actually the Fed acts, and lowers interest rate if it's not warranted. It's not going to be good economically. But here's where I want to warn people about. This is it's not going to be just a Trump phenomenon. I mean, Trump is actually obviously expressing it in a way that is very unsettling to all of us. But I actually think it's an economic reality we're going to have to live with if we don't actually put our fiscal house in order. And I think that unfortunately, like if we don't get our fiscal house in order, the pressure on the Fed are going to be, whether the president puts pressure or not on the Fed, is going to be hard to sustain, right? And we're going to continue to be in a case of fiscal dominance, in which I mean that the Fed policies are somewhat subservient to the need of the fiscal authorities. And that is a bad thing. But that is a bad thing that cannot be resolved exclusively with the Fed chairman saying no. It requires Congress to act and get its put us on a better fiscal path.
Thank you. We have a somewhat related question from the audience. Where do you think the right of center will land post-Trump on populism generally? Do you see a revival of constitutionalism on the horizon? Start with you, Ben.
So I don't think so. We've agreed throughout this whole panel quite a bit, almost exclusively. We may depart from that agreement here. I don't think that the right of center is in as much trouble as one might think. If you look at the legislation coming out of Congress, that's fairly classic conservative ideology, in my view. There are departures, but if you look at OBA, if you look at the TCJA, this was lowering the cost of capital, big cuts in the corporate tax rate. You look at OBA, there was $150 billion for defense spending, another $170 billion for homeland security. This is sort of your classic conservative approach to governing. So I think that if you're looking at legislation coming out of Congress, Republican Congress remains fairly classic conservative with some really important departures, right? I don't want to overstate that, but I don't think conservatism is dead by any stretch. Where does the center right land? I think it really depends on who the leader is. I don't see J.D. Vance as having the same type of charisma that President Trump has. I don't know if there's anyone else that can kind of take the populist mantle. I don't know if we'll see another episode with inflation like we just talked about as a result of these expansions in executive power. But my sense is that, and you can look at this in polls of Americans, Pew does some good work on this. I think only around 23% of people who affiliate with the Republican Party identify as being populists. So I think the center right is probably in better shape than one might think. Although, look, I can be very, very wrong on this, and I've been very, very wrong on these things before. So I think a lot of it is very unique to the president we have.
Jim, do you see this as a populist administration?
Yes, I think yes, it is a populist administration, but it also still has a very strong remnant of traditional Republican thinking. And I think what's going to be interesting at the end of this administration, which parts will be viewed as the most successful? Will the tariffs be viewed as a successful policy that accomplished the many goals mentioned, since it's sort of like this, Swiss knife that can, that can accomplish many things. Will that be viewed as a success, and therefore want to continue it? So that's like, what will the reality be? Will Republicans look back and think, yeah, it's really good that with a rising China, which is allied with other countries which obviously don't have our best interests at heart, in that world, is it good to be not just America first, America alone? So that would be a decision. And so I think ultimately, I think reality counts. And I think the reality is that those kinds of policies will not be looked at universally in a positive way, which will create room for other ideas. And I think a lot of those ideas will be about the power of economic and economic freedom and liberal democracy. So I think you'll be able to. So I think there'll be candidates who will be able to make a very strong argument that those things are. I mean, theoretically, like the label on this chat of ours is supposed to be about modern conservatism, right? So whenever you talk about conservatism, people say, well, what are we conserving? Well, here's what I think we're conserving. We're conserving a political economy of democracy and economic freedom that has served this country pretty well since 1776, and we're closing in on 250. So that is what we're conserving. We're conserving a system which has made America a superpower in any way that you want to define the term. So so I think there'll be conservatives who will be arguing, let's do more of that.
Vero, looking at the current GOP-controlled Congress and the administration, what do you see as the key differences between their approach and traditional free market conservatism?
The list is long. The thing that actually I think is the most unsettling about this administration is how much of their policies are policies of the left, or even like vibe-wise, I hate to say this, but it's kind of like they've crossed lines that conservatives used to say they were fighting against, abuse of executive powers. It's not to say that a conservative administration hadn't abused executive power or even expended them. They had, but they were at least kind of this kind of temperament thing, which that was not a good thing. We've talked about Intel. We've talked about there's just so much that this should be utterly shocking to Republicans or conservatives of 15 years ago. I mean, I just like the way the conservatives and Republicans were talking about President Obama's intervention into the economy as being just utterly shocking. I mean, President Obama almost looks like a Reagan Republican compared to some of the stuff that's being done now. So it's hard. The thing that I find really hard about this administration is like, it's really hard to actually put a label. It's kind of all over the place. Some of the stuff, it's fine to find stuff I like in what they're doing. I mean, I don't like the temperament, let's put it this way, or the way it's done. But it's also this all other area that is kind of utterly just so anti-free market, anti kind of old guard conservative, that is just unsettling, and it all lives together. And that I think is one of the most like just kind of unsettling this. As to where we're going, I just don't know. I think it's kind of, yes, I do hope that basically the failure of some of the policies that are put in place will convince people that it's time to go back to a more conventional free market approach, or like a more free trade approach. But it's hard to actually read. Like if you listen to the way protectionists of today talk about the success of protectionism during the first Trump term, I mean, my head explodes. I don't know if we're looking at different data, or what it is, but we're not seeing the same thing. So I really worry that the same thing is going to happen, that what we're going to see as failures is going to be attributed to something else, maybe not have gone far enough. So I don't know. And here's the thing where I'm a little worried about is kind of we don't like what's going on, and a part of the reason why it's going on is President Trump's personality and his ability to actually kind of, convince Congress to do what he wants them to do. I fear that a successor who will not have that same authority might actually become even more authoritarian in order to get to where. So this is my worst fear. I'm not saying this is. I usually am a long-term optimist for this country. This country is freaking awesome, right? And I do believe that actually there's still a large number of Americans who actually believe in what America stands for, and maybe there's a chance that this kind of center will stand up on the right and on the left for what we believe, and I don't mean in terms of economic policy, but really that the rule of law and free speech and all of these things. I believe that is still a possibility, but I also have like some kind of small nightmare scenario running in my head.
Vero, to follow up on something you said, I'd like to ask the other panelists as well. You said there are some things in this current Congress and administration that you do like. Can you give some examples? What do you like that you see?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Oh, so I think kind of as I said, I mean, I was very, very critical of the One Big Beautiful Bill. First, I hate that name, I mean, I just like the lack of fiscal responsibility of this administration. Is problematic. I mean, there's a moment where I want to ask the American people, I understand you like tax cuts, and believe me, I want government to be really small so I could put it in my pocket, but I don't want to actually kind of do this type of pass this type of bills and then say, the future generation will pay for it. But full expensing, permanent full expensing was a good thing. There are a bunch of things in that bill you can deny where at least from my perspective, were very, very good things. I do think that the focus on energy abundance is a good thing. Whether they're going to achieve it or not is another question. I do think that putting a framework around AI, this is not my area of expertise, but from what I read seems to be things that actually could be really significant and very, very, very important if they succeed. But the difficulty with this administration is actually the really bad stuff they want to do is easy to do by the president, and the really hard stuff is the really, really good stuff is actually harder to achieve. And in the end, even if they did achieve it, we would still be left with a lot of abuse of executive power and a lot of norm breaking that I think are hard to put back in the box.
Thank you. We're unfortunately running out of time. We only have a few minutes left. And so I'd like to ask a wrap-up question. So we are quite a ways from the fusionist conservative philosophy that Republicans had largely embraced since Reagan. You've all talked a little bit about that and about the future. Do you see a way to return to that philosophy, or are things changed forever? Starting with you, Ben.
So I think there's a world. I think that Vero kind of set out the probabilities in the right way, right? Very concerned about this tail end probability where kind of everything breaks down. But I guess the question as far as what. Sorry, Paul. Your question was about what the modern conservative movement looks like moving forward.
Yes. Do you see it? Do you see it returning generally to the way it's been in the past after the Trump presidency, or do you think it's changed forever?
Yeah. So my sense is that the central tenets will remain, and maybe we can even debate the central tenets. I think the conservatives will continue to believe in smaller government, will continue to believe in it would see sort of this constitutionalist view of the legal system, even though I think everyone kind of thinks that their view is the constitutionalist system, regardless of where you fall. Personal liberty, and I think that those central tenets will remain. The big question for me is whether or not a culture war will overshadow some of those central values, and effectively, whether or not sticking it to the other tribe, and this is true of really all Americans, how much that's worth relative to your core values, and so is it worth more to defeat wokeism than it is to have smaller government? And I really don't know. And there's this ongoing debate in academics. At Harvard, you've got Danny Roderick, who writes really insightfully on this, on both what matters more, culture or economics. It feels right now like economics is winning out. I mean, this administration just levied a $3 trillion sales tax on American businesses and consumers, and people seem to care more about, gender issues and, who's swimming in meats. And so my sense is that the culture wars are winning out right now, but that won't necessarily persist for forever.
Jim, what are your thoughts on the future?
I think if the Reagan administration had been voted out of office in 1984 with a terrible economy, we wouldn't be talking about the Reagan legacy. Nothing succeeds like success. And if the results of the tariffs are the jobs flow back in the United States, and again, we're making iPhones here, well, I guess they were right, and they'll be doing great. I think reality will show something different. I think reality will show that that having an economy where economic policy is driven by markets, I think having paying your bills, I think those values will win out because they work. I think it's very easy to focus on cultural issues when there is 4% unemployment and you feel like wages are rising. We'll see what it's like when if inflation's a little bit higher and jobs aren't so easy to get. Events will matter, but I think so will the success or failure of these policies.
Thank you. Vero, do you see a return to free market conservatism?
I think eventually we will get back to something that works better than, that looks more like what we had. That's the optimistic view. But I also think that it also requires a change on the left. I do think that the left of center needs to also become more vocal and more, it's not just the conservative. The conservative movement will not be good or respect the norms and the Constitution if the left is not also is not as good as it can be. And unfortunately, I see both sides having declined in their willingness to defend, or basically they just want to defend it when it's the other side violating it, as opposed to standing for it. So it's all going to depend on how both sides, evolve. But I'm hopeful for this country. There's no other country like this one. And I think that there's a reason why this experience has endured for 250 years or so. And I do think that if a country has a shot, it's this one for this reason.
With that, I think we are out of time, but thank you very much to each of you for joining in this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.